She walked into that courtroom believing justice still meant something. The officers who humiliated her smirked from across the room, convinced the system would protect them. Again, to them, she was just another black woman with no power, no voice, no chance. But that day, something shifted. One sentence from her lips would erase every smug smile and turn silence into shock. Because when truth walks in wearing the face they tried to break, no one leaves unchanged. So, what did she say that made even the judge go pale? The morning began like any other. Calm, predictable, almost painfully ordinary. Tanya Reynolds woke before dawn, just as she always did, the soft hum of her coffee maker filling the silence of her small apartment in Atlanta. Outside, the sky was still a deep shade of blue, the kind that exists only for a few fleeting minutes before sunrise. She liked that hour, the world still half asleep, unjudging, quiet. Tanya worked as an analyst, methodical, organized, almost invisible by design. Her co-workers often said she had that calm kind of brilliance, the kind that made people underestimate her until results spoke louder than personality. She preferred it that way. In a world that judged first and listened later, invisibility sometimes felt like safety. Her days followed a rhythm: morning coffee, news headlines, a quiet drive downtown. The exact route, the same stoplights, the same guard at the courthouse nodding politely as she passed. She had spent years studying the system from the inside, learning its flaws, its faces, its quiet biases hidden beneath layers of procedure and paperwork. She believed change didn't always need a march or a megaphone. Sometimes it needed someone who understood how the system worked and how it failed. But lately, Tanya had begun to feel something shift. The quiet confidence she once carried started to crack each time she saw another headline, another name added to the growing list of those who didn't make it home. She'd seen patterns in the data, in the stories, in the statistics that no one seemed to take seriously. To her, racism wasn't an abstract concept. It was a living organism, subtle but steady, feeding on silence. That week had been heavy. A local case had drawn attention. A young black man wrongfully arrested for resisting when all he'd done was ask a question. Tanya had spent nights combing through evidence, pulling strings of data, cross-checking reports that didn't add up. She wasn't directly involved in the case, at least not officially, but what she found didn't sit right with her. There were patterns, identical errors in reports from the same precinct. Clerical mistakes, they called them. She knew better. Still, she went to work like always. Smile, nod, blend in. Because in the halls of justice, being a black woman meant balancing on an invisible line. Speak too softly and you're ignored. Speak too firmly and you're angry. Tanya had learned to live in the in-between. On that particular morning, she was due to testify as an expert witness. Routine, nothing extraordinary. A small fraud case, unrelated to anything that should have drawn attention, or so she thought. When she entered the courthouse, a faint chill swept through the corridor. Conversations dimmed, replaced by the squeak of shoes and the echo of distant laughter. She caught sight of two officers leaning against the wall, whispering something that ended with a smirk. She felt their eyes follow her as she passed. But she brushed it off. The kind of thing you learn to ignore after years of microaggressions that never quite make it into reports. But that smirk, it stayed with her. Inside the courtroom, everything looked sterile. White walls, fluorescent lights, and an air that smelled faintly of dust and coffee. She took her seat quietly, reviewing her notes. A few minutes later, the same officers entered, still chuckling about something. When their eyes met hers again, one of them muttered under his breath, "Guess they'll let anyone testify these days." A small laugh rippled between them. Not loud enough for the judge to notice, but loud enough for her to hear. Tanya didn't flinch. Years of discipline had taught her control, to measure every blink, every breath. But beneath the calm, her pulse began to quicken. The judge entered. The room rose. The session began. As the case proceeded, Tanya focused on her role, presenting facts and figures with precise clarity. But something about the officer's presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. They weren't even part of the case she was testifying for, yet there they sat, arms crossed, whispering, laughing at private jokes. Every so often she could feel their gaze, dismissive, mocking, invasive. When the session broke for recess, she gathered her papers and turned toward the hallway. That's when she heard it again. "Smart one, isn't she?" "Yeah," the other replied. "For one of them." The words hit harder than they should have. Not because she hadn't heard worse. She had. But because it came from people sworn to uphold justice inside the very building that claimed to protect it. She froze for a moment, the folder in her hand trembling slightly. Every instinct told her to let it go. Don't cause a scene. Don't make yourself the story. That's what her mother had taught her. Pick your battles, baby. The world's already fighting you enough. So she didn't turn around. Not yet. She walked to the restroom, closed the stall door, and exhaled. Her reflection in the mirror stared back. Composed, professional, unreadable. That's who she had to be. But the reflection also asked a silent question. When does silence become surrender? She didn't know the answer, and not yet. But deep down, she felt a line being drawn. By the time she stepped back into the hallway, something in her had shifted. That's when she noticed one of the officers, the taller one, watching her phone screen as she texted a colleague. His eyes narrowed, a faint grin forming. He said something to his partner, who laughed again. It was small, subtle, almost meaningless to anyone else. But Tanya knew. Mockery had a rhythm, and theirs had turned into a pattern. She straightened her jacket and walked past them without a word. But the thought clung to her like static. They think I'm powerless. And that was the moment, quiet and invisible to everyone else, when the story truly began. Tanya returned to her desk that afternoon, pretending nothing had happened. Emails, reports, the sound of her keyboard, the usual rhythm of order and control. But inside, her thoughts were anything but orderly. The laughter from those officers replayed in her mind like an echo she couldn't mute. Every few minutes, she caught herself drifting to the memory of their eyes, their tone, their quiet certainty that they were untouchable. It wasn't the first time she'd seen it. But something about this time felt different, sharper, louder. By late afternoon, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Reynolds?" a voice said. "Male. Official. Measured. This is Officer Kent from Precinct 13. We just wanted to follow up on a few details about your testimony today." Her brow furrowed. "My testimony? I wasn't part of your case." A small chuckle. "I know, just protocol. We like to make sure all witnesses are credible." Something in his tone made her grip the phone tighter. "Excuse me?" "Relax," he said smoothly. "Just doing our job." Then that click. The line went dead. Tanya stared at her phone, her pulse thudding. "Are all witnesses credible?" The words lingered like a threat wrapped in politeness. That night, she left the office later than usual. The parking garage was nearly empty, her heels echoing against the concrete. She reached her car, opened the door, and froze. On her windshield, beneath the wiper, was a folded slip of paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled it free. Only 6 words were written in black marker, bold and uneven. "Careful what you testify for." Her breath caught. For a moment, the world felt utterly still. She looked around. Shadows, corners, silence. Nothing. Her first instinct was to call someone, her supervisor, maybe even the police. But the irony stopped her cold. The police. She crumpled the paper in her fist, tossed it on the passenger seat, and drove home with both hands clenched on the steering wheel. The next morning, Tanya arrived at work early. Sleep hadn't come easily, and the city outside her window felt colder, heavier. She sat at her desk staring at the computer screen, the cursor blinking, a silent metronome marking time she couldn't seem to catch. Then her email pinged. Subject line: Reminder, ongoing review of witness conduct. No sender listed. She opened it. Inside was a single attachment, a photo of her from the courthouse hallway the previous day. She was mid-stride, folder in hand, unaware of the camera. No message, no signature. Just the image. Her stomach tightened. Whoever sent it wasn't trying to hide the threat. They wanted her to see it. By noon, she'd made up her mind. If they wanted to intimidate her, they'd chosen the wrong person. She hadn't spent years decoding patterns of corruption to stay silent when it reached her doorstep. So, she began to dig. She pulled up archived reports, officer names, badge logs, all public data, all technically legal. Her fingers flew across the keys, cross-referencing precinct numbers with complaint filings, officer rosters, and case inconsistencies. What she found made her heart sink. Over the past 3 years, at least 17 cases were all involving black defendants had been dismissed or delayed due to procedural errors. The same 2 officers appeared in nearly every one, and the same internal affairs reviewer had signed off each time. It wasn't incompetence. It was a pattern. That evening, she compiled her findings into a private report, encrypted, time-stamped, stored on a secure drive. She didn't plan to release it yet, but she needed to know she wasn't imagining it. When she shut her laptop, she caught her reflection in the black screen. Her own eyes looked unfamiliar, sharper, more complex. Days turned into weeks. Tanya carried on like nothing had changed, but beneath the surface, every day built more pressure. The officers from that courtroom, she saw them again. Sometimes in the lobby, sometimes outside during her lunch break. Always just close enough to be noticed. Always watching. Once, she stepped out to her car and found her rearview mirror tilted sharply upward. Someone tall had been inside. No forced entry. Nothing stolen. Just a message. "We can reach you." She started locking her doors twice. Started checking over her shoulder when walking home. But fear wasn't the only thing growing. So was determination. One evening, she decided to attend a closed hearing at the courthouse. The same officers were scheduled to appear in a misconduct review. It wasn't open to the public, but she knew how to get in. Years in the system had their advantages. She sat quietly in the back, notebook in hand, as the review began. The panel looked bored. The officers are confident. Their attorney spoke smoothly, polished, practiced, unconcerned. Then, one of them made a mistake. When asked about a missing evidence file, he mentioned a case date that didn't exist in the system. Tanya's pen froze mid-sentence. She'd seen that same date in a falsified record days earlier. Her pulse quickened. She finally had a link. She slipped out quietly, heart pounding. That night, she connected the missing date to the digital timestamp of a deleted arrest file, one she recovered from backup storage. And in that file was something explosive, a signed statement naming one of the officers as having planted evidence. The witness's name had been blacked out, but the digital metadata showed who'd uploaded it. The name made her chest tighten. Detective Alan Cross, the same man who'd called her that first night. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She sent an encrypted email, not to the department, but to a federal contact she trusted. Someone who understood the layers of quiet corruption that kept certain people safe and others silenced. Then she waited. 2 days passed. Nothing. On the third day, her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw a uniform. Her breath hitched. She opened it cautiously. "Miss Reynolds?" the officer asked. "You'll need to come with us." "For what reason?" "Routine questioning." She hesitated. "Do you have a warrant?" A smirk. "Do we need one for a chat?" Her phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. "Don't fight it. Let it play out." Her pulse jumped. It was from her federal contact, so she grabbed her coat and followed them out. At the precinct, the air felt thick. Every conversation stopped when she entered. She was led to a small interview room, a metal table, 2 chairs, and a camera in the corner. The same officers from before entered, casual, almost amused. "Didn't expect to see you here so soon," one said. Tanya sat still, folding her hands. "You called me. What's this about?" They didn't answer. One dropped a folder on the table. Inside were printed screenshots, her emails, her notes, her data logs. "Where did you get this?" she asked quietly. "Funny thing about digital trails," the taller officer said. "They don't stay private for long." Her chest tightened. "That's illegal." "So is falsifying reports," he interrupted smoothly, "if someone were doing that." The silence stretched. They leaned in. "Here's the deal. You forget what you think you found. We forget you were ever snooping. Everyone walks away happy." Tanya didn't speak, didn't blink. Finally, she said, "You just confirmed everything I needed to know." The smirk vanished. For a split second, tension crackled in the air, sharp, dangerous. Then one of them laughed. "You think anyone's gonna believe you?" Tanya looked straight into the security camera. "They will now." The officer frowned. She reached into her jacket and placed a small recording device on the table. The red light blinked. His expression changed instantly, from confidence to panic. Before he could move, the door swung open. 2 federal agents entered. "That's enough." The room fell silent. The officers froze as badges flashed and cameras turned their way. Tanya sat motionless, the faintest trace of relief in her eyes. But it wasn't over. That night, after hours of questioning and paperwork, Tanya was released. The agents told her she'd done the right thing, that her evidence would go straight to Internal Affairs and the Justice Department. She wanted to believe them. But when she returned home, her apartment door was ajar. She stepped inside slowly, every instinct screaming, papers scattered. Drawers open, her hard drive gone, and on her kitchen counter a note. "We told you to stay quiet." She backed away, her breath shaking. Then, a sound. A soft creak from the hallway. She turned. Nothing. Heart racing, she ran to her car and drove straight to a nearby hotel. From there, she called her contact again. This time, he answered. "They know," she said. "They broke in." His voice was calm. We anticipated that. Listen carefully. You need to show up tomorrow morning. Courtroom 5, Federal Wing. Bring nothing but yourself. No phone, no bag. Why? Because tomorrow, he said, they'll learn who you really are. The line went dead. That night, Tanya didn't sleep. She replayed every moment, every smirk, every threat, every word. It all led here. She thought of her mother's warning, pick your battles, and realized this one had chosen her long before she ever stepped into that courtroom. As dawn broke, the city outside glowed in pale orange light. She stood by the window, watching people hurry to work, unaware of the storm quietly unfolding beneath the surface of their justice system. She took a deep breath, straightened her blazer, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled because tomorrow wasn't about survival anymore. It was about exposure. And for the men who laughed at her, tomorrow would be the day laughter turned to silence. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. Not louder, not busier, just heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Tanya walked through the metal detectors with nothing but a folder in her hand. No phone, no bag, no shield, but her composure. Her steps echoed against the marble floor as she entered Courtroom 5, Federal Wing, just as her contact had said. Inside, the same officers sat at the defense table. The same smirks, the same air of untouchable arrogance. But today, something was off. Their laughter was quieter, uneasy, because this time the audience wasn't a handful of staffers or clerks. This time, the room was packed. Reporters lined the benches. Government officials whispered in the back. A federal judge presided, calm, deliberate, unreadable. Tanya took her seat at the witness table, her pulse steady despite the storm she felt inside. She had been here before. Not this courtroom, not this moment. But this feeling, that thin line between fear and conviction where truth lives. The judge glanced down at the file. Ms. Reynolds, you've been called here to provide testimony regarding alleged misconduct and falsification of legal records by certain officers within the department. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. Her voice didn't tremble. One of the officers, Kent, leaned back in his chair, arms folded, smirking again. With all due respect, Your Honor, this witness has been under review for questionable behavior. I'd caution the court about credibility. The judge didn't look up. We'll determine credibility by evidence, Officer Kent. Proceed, Miss Reynolds. The smirk faltered. Tanya stood. The folder in her hands wasn't thick, but what it contained could unravel years of silence. I spent the last 8 years as a systems analyst within the Department of Justice, she began, her tone calm but carrying weight. My work primarily involved tracking procedural errors, data anomalies, and report inconsistencies across state and federal law enforcement databases. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. The officers' eyes flicked toward each other. I was instructed, she continued, to analyze recurring discrepancies in dismissed cases involving minority defendants. What I found was not random. It was deliberate. She opened the folder. A series of documents appeared on the monitor. Case logs, signatures, timestamps. One after another, the same pattern emerged. Same precinct, same officers, same mistakes. Each time, she said, pointing to the highlighted sections, evidence was either lost, mislabeled, or altered. But the metadata, the digital fingerprints, told another story. The judge leaned forward. Are you suggesting this data manipulation was intentional? Yes, Your Honor. And I can prove who authorized it. She clicked again. A final document appeared. An internal communication, time-stamped. digitally signed. At the bottom, Detective Alan Cross and Officer Daniel Kent. The silence that followed was absolute. Kent shot to his feet. "That's a lie! You forged that!" The judge raised a hand. "Sit down, officer." But Tanya didn't flinch. "It's not forged. Every transmission is backed by federal encryption. You can verify the checksum yourself." Kent's jaw clenched. His partner stared at the screen, face pale. Tanya looked directly at them. "You wanted to know if I was credible. You're about to find out." For a moment, it felt like victory. But she knew better. This was the eye of the storm. Because that's when the defense attorney stood. Slick, confident, rehearsed. "Your Honor, before we entertain accusations from someone under internal review, may I ask who exactly this woman represents? Because it seems she's playing a game far above her clearance level." The room shifted. Heads turned. The tension crackled. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Ms. Reynolds, do you wish to respond?" Tanya hesitated. Just long enough for the weight of every threat, every warning, every moment of fear to settle in her chest. Then she said quietly, "Yes, Your Honor. I think it's time I do." She turned toward the courtroom, her voice steady. "For months, I stayed silent, believing the system could correct itself. But silence only protects those who exploit it. So before we go further, I should clarify something." She reached into her folder again and pulled out a sealed letter, placing it on the judge's bench. The wax emblem caught the light, an official U.S. government insignia. "I wasn't just a systems analyst," she said. "I was embedded under federal directive." A collective gasp swept through the room. "My name is Tanya Reynolds," she continued, her tone now precise, cutting through the chaos. "And I'm with U.S. intelligence. My assignment was to investigate internal corruption tied to racially motivated falsification of arrest records." For a long second, no one moved. Then the judge turned to the officers, voice cold. "Officers, please remain seated," but they didn't. Kent's hand twitched toward his belt. A flash of panic crossed his face. Not guilt anymore, but survival instinct. The bailiffs moved instantly. Two of them restrained him, forcing his arms behind his back. His partner stumbled, shouting, "You can't do this!" "You don't understand—" "Oh," Tanya said quietly. "I understand perfectly." The next moments blurred into chaos, raised voices. Federal agents entering, reporters rushing for quotes. Through it all, Tanya stood still, her breathing even. Her eyes fixed forward. The judge ordered the room cleared, but the damage was done. Cameras had already caught the reveal. Her identity, their corruption. The moment the power shifted, when the doors finally shut and silence returned, the judge addressed her directly. "Ms. Reynolds, or Agent Reynolds, I assume your department has been coordinating with federal oversight?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "This case is one of many under active review." The judge nodded slowly, processing the weight of it. "Then this court will cooperate fully." It was over. Or it should have been. But as she gathered her papers, something caught her attention. A movement in the back of the room. A man in a dark suit, unfamiliar, slipped out quietly before anyone noticed. Her instincts screamed. She turned to one of the agents beside her. "Who cleared that man?" He frowned. "Which one?" But the man was gone. Later that afternoon, Tanya sat alone in a conference room as agents sorted through her files. Every detail she'd gathered was now evidence. Every risk is now justified, but something still gnawed at her, that man's face. She'd seen it before, not in person, in a file. One of the sign-offs above the officer's misconduct reports, the internal review officer. She realized then The rot went deeper than anyone expected. Her contact entered quietly, placing a file on the table. "You did well," he said. "The operation's officially out. Those two will face charges." She nodded but didn't smile. "There's someone else involved." He paused. "Who?" She tapped the folder. "The reviewer. He's been protecting them. Maybe more," he sighed. "We'll handle it from here." But Tanya had heard that before. "We'll handle it." It was the exact phrase that always meant it'll be buried. She stared out the window, watching the city breathe beneath the fading sunlight. People walked freely, unaware that justice was often a negotiation, not a guarantee. Her contact's phone buzzed. He stepped outside to take the call, closing the door behind him. Tanya turned back to her folder, only to find another envelope placed inside that she hadn't seen before. No label, no signature. Just her name, handwritten. Her heart sank. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No words. Just a photo. Her apartment taken from across the street. A chill ran through her. It wasn't over. She looked up just as her contact re-entered. "You all right?" he asked. Her voice was low. "They know where I live." He froze, then took the photo from her hands. "We'll move you tonight. You'll be protected." But Tanya shook her head. "No, I'm not hiding." Her eyes hardened, steady with conviction. "If they want to silence me, they'll have to do it in front of everyone." She stood, straightening her jacket again. The same one she'd worn that first day in court. The truth doesn't belong in the dark anymore. Her contact hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Then we make it public." The next morning, headlines blazed across the country. Federal agent exposes. Racist corruption ring inside police department. Courtroom twist. Officers who mocked black woman learn her true identity. The world finally knew. But even as the nation watched, as cameras replayed the moment of truth again and again, Tanya remained cautious. She'd learned that exposure didn't always mean closure, because behind every system built on silence, there's always someone waiting to rebuild it. That evening, she returned to the courthouse one last time. Empty now. Quiet. The bench where she'd once sat still bore the faint scratches of her pen. The same room where they'd laughed at her now stood as evidence of arrogance, of truth, of justice finally blinking awake. She closed her eyes, remembering her mother's voice again. "Pick your battles, baby." She smiled softly. This one was worth it. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed. No caller ID. She hesitated, then answered. A voice. Calm. Measured. Familiar. "This isn't over, Agent Reynolds. You opened a door you can't close." The line went dead. Tanya stared at the phone, the weight of the words settling in her chest. Then she looked up at the courtroom doors, sunlight spilling through the cracks. Her expression hardened. Not fear this time, but resolve, because justice, she realized, was never a destination. It was a fight. And she wasn't done fighting. The courtroom had never been that quiet. Moments ago, laughter filled the air, cruel, mocking, careless. But now it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every officer, every spectator, every judge who had once looked at her with condescension now stared in stunned disbelief, because the woman they had ridiculed had just shattered their illusion of power. When she revealed her role, her work tied to U.S. intelligence, her years of service protecting the very country that had just humiliated her, the smirks vanished. Their arrogance, so loud minutes ago, dissolved into silence so sharp you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She stood taller, meeting their eyes with the calm dignity they tried to strip away. For the first time, they saw her not as a stereotype, not as a target, but as a mirror, reflecting everything ugly they refused to face about themselves. Outside the courthouse, the world reacted fast. Clips of her statement spread online, grainy courtroom footage, voices whispering in shock. Within hours, the story became more than news. It became a reckoning. People who had never cared about injustice before couldn't scroll past her face, her composure, her quiet strength, and for those who had lived through it, who had been laughed at, profiled, dismissed, she became proof that silence can roar. But for her, the victory wasn't about headlines or humiliation returned. It was about truth, finally spoken aloud in a room that had thrived on pretending not to hear it. That night, she sat alone in her apartment. The glow from the city lights spilled through her window, reflecting on the same hands that had once trembled in fear. The same hands that now rested steady on the table. She thought of every name that never made it this far, every black man and woman who never got the chance to speak their truth before the world decided it for them. She knew her story wouldn't fix it all, but it could start a ripple. Maybe somewhere a young girl would watch her clip and see what dignity looks like when the world tries to strip it away. And maybe a cop, one who laughed, one who looked the other way, would hear her words echo in his mind the next time he reached for his badge. Days later, a letter arrived. It was from someone she didn't know, a mother, from another state. "My son was stopped last year," it read. "He didn't make it home. But when I watched your story, I cried, because for the first time I saw someone look them in the eye and make them listen." She read that letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it on her desk beside the court papers. It wasn't closure. It was a purpose. The system didn't change overnight. It never does. But something had shifted, not in laws or policies, but in the quiet corners of human awareness. And sometimes, that's where revolutions begin. Every time her story played online, someone paused longer before judging. Every time her name was mentioned, someone remembered what courage looks like when wrapped in pain. And in that remembering, maybe the world took one small step toward understanding and away from ignorance. Because racism doesn't end with outrage. It ends when the people who've been silent finally choose to see, when justice stops being selective, when laughter in a courtroom no longer echoes louder than truth. She didn't want fame. She wanted fairness. She didn't want to be remembered as the woman who shocked a courtroom, but as the woman who reminded it what justice is supposed to mean. As she walked past the courthouse weeks later, the same steps where they once mocked her now felt different, not because the world had changed completely, but because she had. "They laughed at me once," she would later say in an interview, "but that laughter told me everything I needed to know about the fight ahead. And now, that fight belongs to all of us because her story isn't just hers, it's ours. It's every voice silenced. Every injustice is ignored. Every truth that deserves to be heard, no matter who it makes uncomfortable. So the question remains, how many more times will the world need to be shocked before it finally decides to listen? If this story moved you, don't let it fade away when the video ends. Please share it. Talk about it, because silence protects the problem. But stories like hers? They wake the world up. Subscribe for more real stories that make you feel, not just watch. Together, we can make sure her truth, and so many others like it, are never forgotten.